Mike. It's now a very great pleasure to introduce somebody who's probably very familiar to you. It's our own Paul, the IAA President. Paul is an acknowledged astrophotographer and a very enthusiastic one. Paul has actually won the IFAS Photography Award several times, Paul, if I'm not mistaken. And earlier on he mentioned the exhibition at Clockworthy. Well, Paul has a number of photographs in there as well. So, at this stage, Paul, if the technology allows us, are you all right?
Oh, I'm sure we'll be fine. That's
okay, we'll go. So I'll hand back to Paul.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Andy. Well, yeah, I want to just have a bit of fun with all this tonight, actually, as I'm sure a lot of people have the perception when you use the word astrophotography these days that this is a hobby that requires you to spend sort of car money trying to sort of imitate the capabilities of the Hubble Space Telescope in your back garden. And actually it's not like that at all. I'm just going to go through a few things. So that if you have a camera, a simple camera that you take on holiday or something like that, that you can actually do things with it. These days cameras are really quite capable, so I'm going to go through a few bits and pieces here. Just say roughly what's in a camera these days is you have at the front of a camera you have a lens that lets the light in. You have an aperture ring that decides how much of the light goes through the lens. You may have a mirror, you may not have a mirror. But if you do have a mirror, then that'll divert some of the light through a prism so you can actually see directly through the lens. That's an SLR type camera. You have a shutter that will open for a certain amount of time to let light onto the sensor. And the sensor plate these days is digital. It used to be a piece of film, and you got a new sensor every time you bought film, but it's not like that anymore. You have a digital sensor here. Otherwise, it all works pretty much the same way. I'll just go through a few different variations on the theme. The idea is you let light in, a certain amount of light in for a certain amount of time, and you have your sensitivity set to a certain amount. And those are the three things that determine camera exposures. It's that simple. So common sorts of camera. Well, probably most people have got a compact camera of some sort. And there's one there, and I happen to have that particular one. I carry around in my pocket. You can do useful pictures of the sky with modern compact cameras. They're quite good, particularly high-end ones that have full control of things. You need really to have things like manual exposure at the very least, and some sort of control over the workings of the camera. So the things I just said there with the aperture, the shutter time, and shutter sensitivity. The more of those you can control, the easier it is to get nice pictures of the sky. Moving up from that, there's a thing called bridge cameras, and that's one there. I don't have that one, but same sort of idea. You take the sensor out of a compact camera. The back half of this camera is pretty much the same as a compact camera. What's different is it's got a great big lens on the front, and what they do now is by using the fact that the sensor in these is very small, you can actually get great magnification in a sort of a lens that you can carry around, not in your pocket, but in a shoulder bag or something or other. And that there says 25 to 600. Now that's a wide angle to an extreme telephoto lens in that camera. But here's the catch. That is equivalent. That's not real. A 600 millimeter lens is that long. And that is a 600 millimeter wide aperture, f2.8 lens. f2.8 would be that big at the front if it was a real it's not. It's a 100 millimeter lens, and it's much smaller to fit into that nice little body. But those cameras are actually reasonably good these days, and you can take quite good pictures with them. Just put them on a tripod. Just here's a sort of a straightforward setup. You don't need anything huge. Now this is all you need. Something that simple. That is a micro 4/3 camera with a wide angle lens on it on a lightweight tripod, and that's just how I take that out to shoot the auroras. And that no problem at all. You can get bigger, better ones of these with bigger sensors. Now they're improving the design. You don't then get quite as long a lens, but hey, it's all a compromise. Just to give you an idea. Now, that was taken with a bridge camera on Monday night. A 600 millimeter equivalent lens, a Lumix FZ200 in fact, and I call that the super zoom super moon because that's what it is. It gets quite good detail on the moon, and that was through thin cloud, so it's got this sort of lunar corona effect around it, where you've got blue light around the moon and then this sort of rust-coloured circle there. But that was taken not with a telescope of any sort, or no motors, no computers involved, anything like that. It was taken with a camera on a tripod, and that's all. I probably could have got away even with doing that handheld, but that's pushing the limits of things a little bit. Some of you have probably got something a bit more elaborate. The digital single lens reflex camera is the photographer's tool of choice generally these days, and there's a fair range of those, and you can, if you ever get involved in discussions on forums on the internet and stuff, you can get into the great debate about whether Nikon or Canon is better. And let me tell you that, as I haven't got either of them, I can tell you they're both great cameras and you'll take great pictures with either of them. But here you've got a lens on the front, and you've got, exactly as I described it, a mirror in the middle and the shutter behind, and you can actually see through the back there, optically through the lens. And there's a few things about that design. It's a 1935 design, believe it or not. It hasn't really changed much since, apart from the sensor changing from film to digital. That's the biggest single change has been. For astronomy, it's a little bit difficult to actually put that on the back of a telescope, for the reason that it's a long way from there to the sensor, because it's got all this mirror stuff in the middle. So in 2008, Panasonic made a completely different type of camera. This one here, this is the 7th, this is the G7, they made a G1 was the initial one. You can see they've just dispensed with that whole business of having a mirror in the middle. There's the lens mount and there's the sensor right behind it. And everything comes off the sensor, so your viewfinder up here is electronic. And that has a lot of advantages for when it comes to doing astronomical stuff. One is that this, you're looking through an optical viewfinder, and when it's dark, so is the viewfinder. But this one here, you're looking at electronic, and it amplifies, so that actually you can see things even in the dark. As long as there's enough light on the sensor, you can see an image. Furthermore, you can magnify it. You press a button and you can zoom in on a star and focus it precisely, manually. And you can even, there's a thing called peaking as well. I don't know if you've ever seen that. It gives you sort of a blue glow around things that are exactly in focus. So I've gone from that to that, and I really enjoy using this more. The other thing with that is, because this is really close here, you can put any old lens on it, and that's great fun too. I've got a collection of ancient lenses that actually take good pictures. So that's one type of things. Mounts, you've got to hold everything steady. You can try hand holding things, but really once the light falls, you'll need long shutter speeds and it doesn't work. So the easiest thing is a simple tripod like my one here, just to keep the camera steady, and then you can do quite long exposures. And to avoid vibrating things, if you've got a cable release, use that, or if you haven't got that, there's a self-timer. You can set most self-timers to 2 seconds, which means that you press the button, you walk away, 2 seconds later the exposure happens, and you've any sort of jogging of the camera that you've done in pressing the button has happened by then. The other thing you can do in this modern day and age, crazy high-tech world that we live in, is you can use Wi-Fi control from your phone, and that's pretty handy as well. A lot of modern cameras are Wi-Fi controllable, and you can even see what you're doing on your phone, which is quite impressive. But there is a problem when you start to do things like taking pictures of the stars and trying to get anything worthwhile. Your exposures become long enough that the rotation of the Earth becomes a problem. And actually, the rotation of the Earth becomes a problem rather more quickly than you might think. You might think that it takes, in fact, 23 hours and 56 minutes for the Earth to rotate once, and therefore, you've got a fair bit of time here to. And no, you have not. It depends on how much magnification of the sky you're trying to get when you take your picture. But even with quite wide-angle lenses, after a few seconds, it is obvious that the Earth is moving. So you can have a thing called an equatorial mount. And this is sort of the simplest form of tracking device. And the great advantage of it is it only needs one motor. And that's where you actually point the axis of this towards the North Pole. And then you have a motor that drives this round once a day. And that will actually keep track of moving objects. You can have other types of things where you've got two motors, but the trouble with them is that although they'll keep pointed at the object itself will go round and round within your field of view. So this is actually the best way of doing it, an equatorial mount. And the trouble with equatorial mounts is that you need to polar align them, and this is in itself a black art. I'll show you a picture, I'll show you why it's a little bit more difficult than you might think in a picture I'm going to show you a bit later. But that's generally speaking what you do. You go from a tripod onto an equatorial mount as your next step. Now, things to set on the lens. There are 3 adjustments on a lens. Those of you who are used to telescopes will be used to only one of these really, which is a telescope. You simply focus it. And this is the key adjustment. Most things, if you get them a little bit wrong, then you can sort them out later. If you haven't quite got enough exposure, you can sort that out later. If you've overexposed it a little bit, you can usually sort that out a bit. But if you've got the focus wrong, it's wrong and will always be wrong. So you need to do everything you can to get the focus exactly right. And I find using a mirrorless camera, the magnified live view, by the way, the compact and bridge cameras can do this sometimes as well. Or if you set your autofocus on distant lights, and they don't really have to be all that far away to approximate infinity. Anything that's a mile or so away is to all intents and purposes infinity for all except the very longest lenses. And then you just switch it to manual focus and leave it there. As long as you don't touch it, it's going to be okay. I like magnified live view myself because you can actually do it very precisely that way. Now then, aperture. With telescopes, you don't normally stop telescopes down. With lenses you can, and there are reasons why you would. Although you're losing a bit of light every time you stop a lens down, it does tend to be a little bit sharper. Sharper not just in the middle, but into the corners as well. Lenses are sharper, stop down a little bit. And the other thing that you can adjust with a lot of lenses that you can't really do with telescopes is actually the focal length. Zoom lenses are not bad these days. You can actually have zoom lenses that have reasonable apertures and stuff. The only two things I would say about zoom lenses for astrophotography purposes is that one is they tend to have a smaller aperture, so you're playing with less light, and the other is that whereas that's what a prime lens, that's a prime lens on the front of my little camera there, i.e. a lens that only has one focal length, might only have 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 pieces of glass in it. A zoom lens might have 15 or 20. And the trouble with that is that every glass surface reflects some light, so you can get lens flares and internal reflections and stuff that messes up your pictures. But there we are. So that's lens settings, things to be aware of. Things set on the camera. I'll come back to this business of the Earth's rotation here, because you need to set your shutter speed, and generally speaking, for dark sky subjects, that will be several seconds you're looking at there to capture enough light to capture stars and nebulas in the Milky Way and auroras and whatever. And if you want to keep the stars sharp, then there is this rule that started out life in full frame days called 600/f. There are the modifications for modern sensor sizes. If you have what we call an APS-C sensor, that's the normal DSLR type sensor now. It's called 400/f, or for micro four thirds like my camera there, 300/f. And that is really saying that you take your focal length and divide it into whichever number you've chosen there, and this will give you your maximum length of exposure that you can get without the stars moving. And with a 50mm lens, the good old-fashioned 50mm lens that you can buy on eBay for about tuppence now, 12, 8 or 6 seconds, depending on your format there. It magnifies more on a smaller sensor. and so the time you can expose for is less. But to be honest, I use it at 10 seconds on Micro Four Thirds, and it's okay because you get a little bit more latitude. That's the worst case, i.e. pointing towards the equator. But if you're looking up towards the pole more, then you can go a bit longer. I would always advise just setting everything manually. I mean, you can use automatic modes if you want to, but they tend to do things wrong. For example, the most extreme case of getting it wrong is if you try and take a picture of the moon with an automatic mode, then the camera will try and average out the black areas around the moon with the white areas that are the moon and just burn out all the surface detail. So you'll get a white disk and a black background. Whereas what you really want is the correct exposure for the moon's disk, and that is a daylight exposure. That's the same sort of exposure you would use out in the street here, because the moon is the same distance from the sun as the Earth, and so it is lit by the sun to the same extent as the Earth, and you end up having a daytime exposure. I used to think, when I first got into this, I'd need quite a long time for the moon, but you don't. Short exposures. I would also advise anyone doing this to shoot RAW. Most really high-end cameras will shoot RAW plus JPEG. If JPEG pictures are great for your ordinary holiday snaps, the camera has just done the processing for you and ripped out loads of the data which you might actually want to try and use, and the RAW file has got what the sensor saw, and that's really useful when you get into advanced Photoshop and stuff. You need the RAW files. So, sensitivity. And really it's a balancing act. The more you turn up the sensitivity, the more noise there is in the picture. The bigger the sensor, the better it is at doing that. The smaller the sensor, the more noise comes in. So somewhere like my little camera there will go up to ISO 12,800, but I wouldn't dare use it at that. At 3200, that's about as far as it goes, really. Most cameras will give you settings that are completely unusable. I think the marketing people insist on it or something like that, but really you don't need so much, but more than the bottom. They'll go to 100 at the bottom and they'll be really clean images, but unfortunately your shutter speeds will be so long that you'll never get enough light. The other thing, white balance. Sometimes if you're in a light polluted sky, changing your white balance to something more akin to a tungsten type setting of 3000K or so will actually make the background much more neutral, i.e. less orange. It means that your star colours will be wrong, but that's not so difficult to deal with. And here's me just doing it. This was actually me taking a moon picture the other evening. That's a little 105mm Meade telescope and an Olympus Micro Four Thirds camera on the back of it there. And you'll see one problem here, it's actually got too much magnification because I can't actually fit the moon on the sensor. And I'll show you a little while how I deal with that. But here, that is magnified live view in action. That is really easy to focus that because I've zoomed right in on a part of there. By the way, you'll see my shutter speed there is 160th. That's what you need for the moon. So there we are. That's.
Well, just before you
could
you explain the M43 APS-C in full frame?
Yes, they're just different camera mounts. M43 is Micro Four Thirds, which is the mount that Panasonic and Olympus make, and it's a bit smaller sensor than APS-C, which is a bit bigger, and most ordinary DSLRs use that. The higher grade of digital SLR uses the same size frame as 35mm film, and the price and picture quality goes up accordingly. So that's really the three main interchangeable lens mounts. There are others, but those are the three main ones. And it's the sensor size that is the main difference between them. They all take great pictures, but slightly different limitations one way or another. Putting things on a telescope. You might want to do this. I'm not going to go too far into this aspect of things, but there's ways of doing it. That is a digital SLR, what happens is that the telescope manufacturers make their own interface between the telescope and a standard called the T-mount. That is a T-mount there. And then there is a T-mount available for pretty much every kind of camera. And just to show you one, actually, that this here, you can come up and look at this afterwards, but this is actually, this is a Meade telescope mount on the front here. So that has the screw thread that goes onto the back of a Meade telescope. It then goes into a T-mount, which is a Minolta T-mount there. And this here converts my old Minolta lenses to micro four thirds mount. And they just all snap together nicely like that. There is another simpler way of doing it. And this just makes a micro four thirds camera pretend to be an eyepiece. It's not a terribly secure connection really, but I have taken good snaps that way when I've had to. It enables the sensor to get very close to the telescope, which if the telescope doesn't focus out very far, can be useful. Other things there, that's the eyepiece mount I just showed you. Digiscoping mounts, this is, some people do this, you can get, it's a clamp really that will take your compact camera with its fixed lens and stick it on the back of a telescope and it looks through the eyepiece. And you have to line it up very, very accurately to see so that the axes of the two lenses meet. But you can get reasonable pictures of stuff like the moon that way. My first moon pictures were taken that way. Okay. Let's have a look at some pictures. That's just a camera on a tripod with a fisheye lens, and I've used a bit of help that came my way to do some foreground lighting with it. So what we've got here, two planets, Venus and Jupiter, I think, or maybe the other way around. This was taken a few years ago, so they're not where they are now. And then we've got a fairly bright moon up here, which I've kept out of the frame. But we have here the great square of Pegasus there, Andromeda there, I think just two stars of Cassiopeia up there, Seven Sisters there, the Hyades there, and over here we've just got the top end of Cygnus. So very, very wide field of view, but I've just made it a little bit more interesting by waiting for a car to come along, and these headlights have lit up the tree for me here, and I've now got these lights streaking through here. So exposure for a few seconds just on a tripod with a fisheye lens. Nothing too fancy, but you know, a nice picture. First astrophoto I ever took, probably the best one as well. I found myself in the South Island of New Zealand, the place where they've just had the earthquake, at a place called actually Franz Josef Glacier. And it is the darkest, most fantastic sky I've ever seen. And I wanted to just try and capture it, and I sort of did all the maths of what I could do here, and I just took some pictures on my film camera. Of course, the trouble with film cameras is this, that when one of the key settings is your ISO sensitivity, and with film cameras you make that decision when you're in the shop buying your film, and when you sort of think, well, and I had no idea I was going to do this, and I just went off with, I was going to take pictures of mountains and glaciers and stuff, and I thought, well, I've only got 200 here, so I opened the lens right up, did it for 15 seconds, which I decided was the longest I could do, and here we have. If you're familiar with that part of the world, this is all part of the southern Milky Way. That's called the coal sack, that black bit there. This is the Southern Cross. It's upside down, but if you imagine an Australian or New Zealand flag, they both have that constellation on them, Crux. And this up here, that's Alpha Centauri, and that's Beta Centauri there. And I did decide, when looking at this very, very closely, that somewhere there I could see Proxima Centauri. It's one of those red dots, but but actually with the star map you can sort of say, yep, it's that one. But there we are. That's quite good. That's the good old days of film when this was all difficult. That's another film one. That was one of those photographs that I wasn't going to take that as my first total solar eclipse, and I was just going to watch it. But I had a camera around my neck, so what are you supposed to do? I did just take one picture, and this is, you see the eclipse itself is up here, but this was a very short duration eclipse, and so the width of the shadow in the sky wasn't that great at all. You can see these bits here where there is no eclipse. The eclipse is only partial in those places. But a little bit of camera shake on that if I'm critical, but it was just something that I had to take, really. And again, the film speed was decided for me in the shops. Now, once you get to take a picture, the fun really starts when you start taking lots of pictures. And your best friend is one of these here. And that is an intervalometer, just plugs into the camera, and you can set various things here. That one's a Canon, so it probably costs about £100. Mine's called a Young Chow, and the same thing costs £20. But there we are. And you can do things. You can stack up pictures. You can add pictures together. You can take lots of pictures to reduce noise and get more detail out of them. You can show movement for things like star trails. You can stick them together to cover a wider area. You can make animations, and you can make slideshows. And I'll just briefly go through all of those. There's a bit of free software called Deep Sky Stacker that will do all this for you. And you put 3 types of picture into it. This is one picture, and that's the Seven Sisters. And you try and take a lot of those, take 20 or so of those, all the same. Then put the lens cap on and take more pictures. And you think, what's the point of that? Well, what you get there is you get all the noise. And what you can do in Deep Sky Stacker is subtract all that out. And then you'll find that lenses, telescopes, whatever, are generally brighter in the middle than they are in the corners. And you can correct that by creating flat frames. And what you do there, you do it in the daytime. Same setup, same optical setup, same camera, same lens, same telescope, whatever. You just put a white t-shirt over the end and expose it to daylight and take some pictures and throw that into the mix here. And Deep Sky Stacker does its incredible magic. It doesn't matter to a certain extent even if these don't line up perfectly, because Deep Sky Stacker actually lines up all the stars for you. As long as each exposure is okay, it's great. And here's what Deep Sky Stacker looks like. And that's what comes out of the end of this process. At least it's evenly lit. It doesn't look very exciting. And that's because you then move on to this thing here, which is the curves control. And you can line up the colours, which it's done for me there, and adjust the luminance a bit. And just a little bit of work on that, and you get that picture, which at least that's got some nebulosity around Merope and stuff there. So it's not a bad picture of the Seven Sisters. You can see which 7 most people see as well, can't you? See there's also loads more. This is another one. This wasn't taken with a telescope, it was taken with a camera lens. It was taken with an ancient 200mm f4 Minolta Rockor lens made in the 1970s. And I just took lots of pictures and added them together, and that came out with a little bit of tweaking. It's still quite noisy. It would have done with a bit more data added to it, but that's the Andromeda Galaxy taken with a 200mm camera lens. That little G3 camera was the camera involved there. Star Trails, that's another bit of free software. There's a lot of these things, and they are sort of one-trick ponies. Photoshop does absolutely everything, but you have to know how to do it. These, you just feed in things, and pictures come out, and that's where I've just taken a whole bunch of pictures. What I was actually doing here was trying to capture Perseid meteors at one stage. And I didn't capture any Perseid meteors at all, but I had all these exposures and thought, well, I'll do something or other with them. I've actually got the International Space Station coming across through 3 of the pictures there. You can see slightly the joins that's there, and you can see if you really use your imagination here. Which one's this? Oh, maybe, yeah, I think that's probably a satellite, I would say. It looks more like a satellite than but I think you're right. But I think you've got the summer triangle there. That's Deneb, Vega, Altair down there in the Milky Way going through it. But, that works very well. Startrails.de. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll put all the web links for this somewhere on the website, just so you can see them all, because there's a lot of them. That's star trail. Oh, sorry, that's star stacks, which is the other one. And that was, I think you've probably seen variations of that picture from there, but that was the aurora at Ballygally on St Patrick's night last year. And I just got, I took about 70 pictures, but for various reasons I took out some and stacked up 53 of them. So you're looking at something like about 20 minutes worth of exposure going on there. And all the stars, they do go round and round and round. And what I was saying to you about polar alignment earlier, here's an interesting one. I've just zoomed right into the middle of that. And you can see that the pole star is not right in the middle, actually. The pole star is just a little bit less than a degree away from, you see, you can tell where the center of all these movements is, and it's kind of, it's about there somewhere, isn't it? But that's a crop there. Polaris is not quite where you line up your equatorial mount to, and that's where the problems start to arise. If you line it up to Polaris, it's okay for short exposures, but it will make mistakes for long exposures. Stitching things up with Autostitch. Autostitch is the most simple piece of software. You just drop pictures into it, and it analyzes them and joins them up together. So when I was taking pictures of the moon the other evening, as I showed you earlier, the moon does not fit on that little camera's sensor with my ETX 105 Meade as the lens, so I have to do something about it, and taking 3 pictures and joining them up does work, because although it's designed for really sort of taking panoramic landscapes and stuff, there's enough information on the moon, enough features for it to match up. It works, and it does also work not just across, but it works up and down as well. So I'll show you what came out. Was that? And I had, by the way, raw processed each one to bring out colour greater there, because the moon is not entirely grey. It does show, it's got blue areas that indicate titanium and sort of rust-coloured areas that indicate iron, but the moon is not totally grey. You can make little films, and I'll show you a trick that I learned here. This is the Movie Maker that comes with Windows 8 and 10, and it's a great little thing actually. Although it's designed for kids, you know, it's and the way it works, you sort of think, well, you know, this is a bit basic. Actually, there's an awful lot in the Movie Maker. You just add loads of pictures. What I've done here is I've just taken again pictures that I took while trying to get meteors, and I sort of had, you know, a couple of hundred pictures that were no use whatsoever. So rather than just press the delete button, I thought, well, I'll have a bit of fun with this. If you put lots of pictures into Movie Maker, it decides that what you want to have is a slideshow. And so this magically appears that the duration, you can drop down that box and you can select durations from 1 second up to 10 seconds. And those would be very sensible durations for having a slideshow. But you can also write your own numbers in that box. So I chose a different number, 0.08. Why did I choose 0.08? Because that would create a video of 12.5 frames per second. You can also equally put 0.04 in there, which will give you a 25 frame per second video. The reason why I've chosen not to there is simply because I didn't have enough pictures to make the video long enough if it was 25 frames per second, because, you know, if I had 250 pictures, it would be gone in 10 seconds, for example. So I wanted to make it a bit longer, so I'd made it 12.5. And then you just save the movie. 720p is a good sort of rate to save, and this is where we're going to find if my animations play. There you go. You have to double click quickly on it, and this is where I was looking for meteors. Didn't get any, but you just see the whole star field move around. But this is the one also that's got the International Space Station comes flying across it shortly. There we go. So that, with better material, you can make quite an interesting little video there, but that's how you do it. One more thing. You can make a nice little slideshow, and I found this wonderful piece of software. Again, it's a one-trick pony. It does only one thing, but what it does very well. and it's called PhotoFilmStrip, and I will put the links for these on the website somewhere. Does anyone know what Ken Burns effect is? Does anyone? I'll tell you the story that Ken Burns is an American documentary filmmaker who makes all sorts of stuff. He's still at it. He's been doing it for years, and he got to a stage where he was making history films about the 1920s, and he found that all the material that he had pretty much came in the form of still pictures. And so he devised the technique of actually using a camera on a stand to move across these pictures, to make them move, and to actually zoom in and out of them to make that a little bit more interesting. Of course, you don't need to do that anymore because a computer just does it for you, but this is how simple this is, that you have each of your pictures on this strip here, and then for each one of them you define the start picture you want and the end picture you want, and it does it for you. And you just set a duration there, which is 7 seconds, and you have a piece of music, and you can put titles on, although I have one piece of personal hatred, which you'll see in a minute. The font that the titles come up in, I can't find a way of changing it, and I don't like it, but I'll show you, that's the last thing I'll tell you before we do some questions, but I made a little film out of this. Was the aurora, the moonlit aurora of the 13th of October. So, yeah. Oh, and the sound works for me as well. Don't like the font, you see. There is a huge moon right behind me that's just lighting up the clouds. So there you go out and take pictures and have a lot of fun. Thank you very much.